The bitter wind of November 1892 howled through the narrow streets of Hartford, Connecticut, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and the distant clatter of factory machinery. In the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, Margaret Sullivan sat, hunched over a ledger, her calloused fingers tracing columns of numbers that refused to balance. The boarding house around her creaked with the weight of winter settling in, and somewhere in the walls she could hear the muffled coughing of Mr. Peterson from room 3, another mill worker whose lungs bore the black dust of Hartford's prosperity. Maggie pressed her palms against her tired eyes, feeling the familiar ache that came from squinting at figures by lamplight. 26 years old, and already her hands looked like those of a woman twice her age. The wedding ring she still wore had grown loose on her finger, not from sentiment, but from the simple fact that she could no longer afford to eat as she once had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years had passed since the accident at the textile mill. 3 years since they'd brought James home on a wooden board, his face peaceful, but his body broken by the machinery that had promised them a better life. The townspeople of Hartford had been kind at first, in the way that proper Christian folk are supposed to be when tragedy strikes. They'd brought casseroles and condolences, nodding solemnly at the funeral and murmuring about God's mysterious ways. But kindness, Maggie had learned, has a short shelf life when it comes to young widows. Soon the whispers started, the sideways glances when she walked to market alone, the sudden silence when she entered the church social hall. A woman without a husband was either pitied or suspected, and Maggie had grown weary of both. Now she shared this rambling boarding house with her unmarried sister Rose, taking in mill workers and traveling salesmen to make ends meet. Rose handled the cooking and cleaning with the efficiency of someone who'd never expected marriage to rescue her from work, while Maggie managed the books and dealt with the landlord. Together, they'd created a small island of respectability in a sea of judgment. But it was an exhausting existence, made more so by the constant undercurrent of disapproval from neighbors who believed a young woman should have remarried by now, should have found another man to take care of her instead of taking care of herself. The morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Maggie made her way down to the kitchen, her breath visible in the cold air. Rose was already at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal that would have to stretch to feed 6 boarders and themselves. Her sister looked up as Maggie entered, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that came from too much coffee and too little sleep. "The Peterson account is 3 weeks overdue," Maggie said without preamble, settling into a chair at the worn wooden table. "And Mrs. Henley from the bank stopped by yesterday while you were at market. She wants to discuss our mortgage terms." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications neither sister wanted to voice aloud. Rose set down her wooden spoon and turned to face her sister fully. At 32, Rose had the kind of plain, honest face that inspired trust in customers and respect from other women. She'd never been courted seriously, had never expected to be, and had channeled her maternal instincts into caring for Maggie through the worst days of her widowhood. Now she studied her younger sister with the keen eye of someone who'd watched grief transform a vibrant young bride into a woman who startled at unexpected sounds and counted every penny twice. "We could take in another boarder," Rose suggested, though they both knew the house was already full to capacity. "Or perhaps I could take on more sewing work from the ladies on Elm Street." But even as she spoke, they both understood the mathematics of their situation. Hartford was full of widows trying to make ends meet, full of women doing piecework by lamplight and taking in washing to pay rent. The competition was fierce, and the wages were designed for survival, not prosperity. Maggie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the window that overlooked the street. Outside, the world was painted in shades of grey and brown, the bare trees reaching toward a sky that promised snow. She watched as Mrs. Crawford from across the street emerged from her house, her black mourning dress stark against the pale morning light. Mrs. Crawford had been widowed for 5 years now, and the lines around her eyes spoke of the slow erosion that came from constantly worrying about money, about respectability, about the future. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if James and I had gone west like he wanted to, Maggie said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. He used to talk about Colorado, about the clean air and the open spaces. Said a man could build something real out there, something that belonged to him instead of to the mill owners. She traced a pattern in the condensation with her finger, remembering the dreams they'd shared in the early days of their marriage, before the factory work had worn him down and the accident had ended everything. Rose joined her at the window, her own reflection ghost-like in the glass. "You were barely 18 when you married him, Maggie. You couldn't have known what life would bring." There was no judgment in her voice, only the weary wisdom of a woman who'd seen too many dreams crumble under the weight of circumstance. "But you're still young. You could still have that life if you were willing to take the chance." The suggestion hung between them, unspoken but understood. Both sisters had heard the stories, whispered in sewing circles and discussed in hushed tones at church socials. Women who'd gone west to marry men they'd never met, who'd traded the familiar poverty of the East for the uncertain promise of the frontier. It was scandalous, of course, the idea of advertising oneself like goods for sale, but it was also practical, in a way that appealed to women who'd learned to value survival over sentiment. As if summoned by their thoughts, the Morning Post arrived with its usual thud against the front door. Maggie retrieved the small bundle of letters and newspapers that constituted their daily connection to the outside world. Most of it was bills and notices, the grim correspondence of people living close to the edge, but tucked among the official envelopes was a copy of the Denver Tribune that Mr. Walsh in room 5 subscribed to, filled with news from the territories and advertisements that painted pictures of possibility. Maggie spread the newspaper across the kitchen table, and both sisters found themselves drawn to the back pages where personal advertisements competed for space with notices for patent, medicines and agricultural equipment. The language was always careful, coded in respectability, but the need behind the words was unmistakable. Men seeking wives, women seeking husbands, all of them looking for connection across the vast distances that separated the settled East from the Wild West. "Established rancher seeks companionship," Rose read aloud, her voice neutral but her eyes bright with curiosity. "Widower with young daughter desires partner in life and work. Must appreciate quiet living and possess strength of character. Colorado territory, good prospects, honest intentions." She looked up at Maggie, who was staring at the advertisement with an intensity that made Rose's heart skip. "There are dozens of them, Maggie. Men who understand what it means to lose someone, who aren't looking for a girl to mold, but a woman to stand beside them." Maggie felt something stir in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the first whisper of possibility she'd felt since James died. The idea of being wanted not despite her widowhood, but because of the strength it had taught her, of being valued for the very qualities that Hartford society found threatening in an unmarried woman, was both terrifying and exhilarating. But even as the thought took root, the practical part of her mind began cataloguing obstacles. She knew nothing about ranching, about life outside the industrial cities of the East. She'd never ridden a horse, never seen mountains, never lived anywhere that didn't smell of coal smoke and ring with the sound of machinery. What if she traveled all those miles only to find herself unwanted once again, rejected for being too old, too worn, too damaged by grief? "They don't know me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "These men, they're looking for wives, not widows. They want someone fresh, someone who hasn't already been broken by life." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but they felt true in a way that made her chest ache. She'd internalized the message that Hartford had been sending her for 3 years, that a woman who'd already buried one husband was somehow tainted, less valuable than an untested girl who still believed in fairy tales. Rose reached across the table and covered Maggie's hand with her own, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of their struggle. "You're not broken, Margaret Sullivan. You're seasoned. There's a difference between something that's been destroyed and something that's been tested and proven strong." Her voice carried the fierce conviction of someone who'd watched her sister survive what would have destroyed weaker women. And any man worth having would see that strength, and thank God for it. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant sound of Mrs. Crawford's footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside. Maggie stared at the newspaper, at the careful words that represented someone else's. Hope for connection, for partnership, for a life built on mutual respect rather than social obligation. Somewhere in Colorado, a man was looking for exactly what she had to offer, even if she couldn't quite believe it yet. That afternoon, while Rose tended to the boarders' rooms and prepared the evening meal, Maggie found herself alone with the newspaper, and a growing sense of preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Possibility. She read through the advertisements again, this time paying attention not just to what the men were seeking, but to what they were offering. Stories emerged from between the lines, tales of loss and determination, of men who'd built lives in harsh places and now sought someone to share the burden and the joy of that building. One advertisement in particular caught her attention, not because it promised more than the others, but because it promised exactly what she'd stopped believing she deserved. Thomas Bennett, Pine Ridge, Colorado, widower, father, rancher, seeking correspondence with woman of character who understands both sorrow and hope. Age and previous marriage, no impediment to serious consideration. Reply to general store, Pine Ridge, Colorado territory. The simplicity of it took her breath away. No false promises of easy living, no requirement for youth or inexperience, just an honest acknowledgement that life included both joy and pain, and that understanding both made someone more valuable, not less. For the first time in 3 years, Maggie allowed herself to imagine being wanted not despite her past, but because of it, chosen not for what she might become, but for what she already was. As the afternoon light faded and the boarding house filled, with the sounds of men returning from their shifts at the mill, Maggie made her decision. She pulled out her best writing paper, the kind she'd been saving for letters she never seemed to write, and began to compose a response that would either change her life or confirm her worst fears about her place in the world. Either way, she decided, it was time to find out which future awaited her beyond the grey streets of Hartford, in a place where the sky was said to stretch forever, and a woman's worth might be measured by something other than the approval of neighbors who'd already decided she didn't belong. The letter lay unfinished on Maggie's writing desk for 3 days, the ink from her pen having dried to leave only the salutation, "Dear Mr. Bennett," staring back at her like an accusation. Each morning she would sit down with the intention of completing it, and each morning the words would refuse to come. How did one summarize a life marked by loss without sounding pitiful? How did one express hope without appearing desperate? The questions circled in her mind like crows, dark and persistent. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Henley from the bank arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, her black wool coat and stern expression announcing the serious nature of her visit before she even spoke. Maggie received her in the small parlor that served as both sitting room and business office for the boarding house, acutely aware of the threadbare carpet and the water stain on the ceiling that no amount of prayer or paint could seem to eliminate. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Henley began, consulting a leather folder thick with documents, "I'm afraid the bank can no longer extend the current terms of your mortgage. The payments have been irregular, and frankly, the board has concerns about the long-term viability of your enterprise." She spoke with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered bad news professionally, her voice neither cruel nor kind, simply matter of fact. Maggie felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. 3 years of widowhood had taught her many things, chief among them the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of disaster. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Henley?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The bank is prepared to foreclose unless you can bring the account current within 60 days, came the reply, as swift and final as a judge's gavel. "That would require payment of all outstanding amounts plus penalties, totaling approximately $400. The sum might as well have been $4,000 for all the chance Maggie had of raising it. Her entire monthly income from the boarding house rarely exceeded $30, and that was before expenses. After Mrs. Henley left, Maggie sat alone in the parlor, staring at the familiar furniture that had belonged to her parents, pieces that represented the only stability she'd known since James died. In 2 months, it would all be gone. The boarding house, the only income she and Rose had, the roof over their heads, everything they'd fought so hard to maintain would belong to someone else. The weight of that reality settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy and inescapable. Rose found her there an hour later, still sitting in the same chair, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on something far beyond the frost-covered windows. "The bank?" Rose asked simply, and Maggie nodded. No further explanation was necessary between sisters who'd learned to read disaster in each other's faces. Rose settled into the chair across from her, and for several minutes they sat in the kind of silence that only comes from shared desperation. "We could ask the church for help," Rose suggested finally, though her tone suggested she held little hope for that solution. Both sisters knew that charity, like kindness, had its limits, especially when it came to women who might be expected to solve their problems through remarriage rather than continued independence. The church ladies who ran the charitable committees had made their opinions clear through years of pointed suggestions about suitable widowers and meaningful glances at Maggie's still slender figure. "They'd help us pack for the poorhouse," Maggie replied with bitter accuracy, right after they finished explaining how this wouldn't have happened if I'd accepted Mr. Morton's proposal last year. The mention of Harold Morton, a widower 20, years her senior, with breath that smelled of tobacco and a wandering eye for housemaids, made both sisters grimace. His proposal had been less about affection than about acquiring a housekeeper who wouldn't require wages, and Maggie's refusal had scandalized half the congregation. The afternoon brought no solutions, only more problems. Mr. Peterson in room 3 announced he'd be leaving at the end of the week, having found cheaper lodgings closer to the mill. Mrs. Davis from room 5 complained about the cold draft under her door and hinted that she might seek accommodations elsewhere if the issue wasn't resolved promptly. By evening, Maggie felt as though she was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, watching the water rise while the passengers debated whether to lower the lifeboats. It was then, in the gathering darkness of her small room, that her eyes fell, again on the unfinished letter to Thomas Bennett. The newspaper advertisement was still folded beside it, the words, "Age and previous marriage no impediment," seeming to glow in the lamplight. For the first time since Mrs. Henley's visit, Maggie felt something other than despair creeping into her chest. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was possibility, and possibility was something she could work with. She picked up her pen and began to write, not the careful, polite letter she'd been attempting, but something raw and honest. born from the desperation of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "Dear Mr. Bennet," she wrote, "I am writing to you, not as a young woman seeking romance, but as a widow who understands that life breaks us all and that the strongest among us are those who learn to build something new from the pieces." The words flowed then, 3 years of suppressed emotion pouring onto the paper in careful script. She wrote about James, about the accident, about the long nights of wondering if she'd ever feel whole again. She wrote about the boarding house and the bank and the 60 days that stood between her and complete ruin. She wrote about Rose, about the weight of responsibility and the fear of failure, about the way Hartford looked at widows and found them wanting. But she also wrote about strength, about the things she'd learned in the crucible of loss. She could manage a household budget with military precision. She could calm hysterical boarders and negotiate with difficult landlords. She could work 16-hour days without complaint and still find energy to care for others. She could face the worst thing that had ever happened to her and still get up each morning, still choose to keep living. "I do not know if you seek a wife or simply a companion," she concluded, "but I can offer you the partnership of someone who has been tested by fire and found herself still standing. If that is enough, if you can see value in a woman who has already loved and lost and learned from both, then perhaps we might find in each other something worth building together." She sealed the letter before she could lose her courage, addressing it to Thomas Bennet, General Store, Pine Ridge, Colorado Territory. The stamp cost more than she could easily afford, but it seemed a small price to pay for the chance at a different future. As she walked through the cold November night to post it, Maggie felt the weight of 3 years of grief and uncertainty shifting on her shoulders, not disappearing, but perhaps becoming bearable. The letter would take at least 2 weeks to reach Colorado, assuming it reached its destination at all. 2 weeks of waiting and wondering, of managing the boarding house and dodging questions from Mrs. Henley, of watching Rose worry about their future while pretending everything would somehow work out. But for the first time since James died, Maggie felt as though she was moving towards something rather than simply enduring, and that feeling was worth whatever uncertainty lay ahead. Part 3. The Unexpected Door. 3 weeks passed before Thomas Bennet's reply arrived. 3 weeks, during which Maggie jumped at every delivery and found herself inventing excuses to check the post office throughout the day. Rose watched her sister's nervous energy with a mixture of amusement and concern, noting how Maggie's usually methodical approach to household management had become scattered and distracted. The boarding house continued to function, but it ran on hope rather than efficiency, sustained by the possibility that somewhere in Colorado, a man was considering the carefully honest words of a Connecticut widow. When the letter finally arrived, thick and official-looking with T. Bennet, Pine Ridge, Colorado Territory, written in bold, masculine script across the back, Maggie nearly dropped it in her haste to carry it upstairs to the privacy of her room. Her hands shook as she broke the seal, and for a moment she was afraid to unfold the pages, terrified that they might contain the polite rejection she'd been expecting since the day she mailed her own desperate confession. Instead, she found something entirely unexpected. Thomas Bennet wrote like a man unaccustomed to pretense, his words direct and unadorned, but somehow more honest for their simplicity. "Mrs. Sullivan," the letter began, "your honesty deserves the same in return. I am 34 years old, widowed for 2 years, father to Lucy, aged 8. My wife died of consumption, and since then we have lived a quiet life on a small ranch outside Pine Ridge, managing cattle and trying to find our way without her." He wrote about loneliness without self-pity, describing the isolation that came from living miles from the nearest neighbor and the weight of raising a daughter who had grown silent since her mother's death. "Lucy," he explained, had been a chatterbox before the illness took hold of the household, full of questions and stories and laughter that had filled every corner of their small ranch house. Now she spoke only when necessary, spending her days helping with chores and her evenings drawing pictures of things she remembered from happier times. "I placed the advertisement not because I seek to replace what I lost," Thomas continued, "but because I have come to understand that grief, while necessary, was never meant to be a permanent residence. Lucy needs to see that life can still hold joy, and I need to remember what it feels like to share the burden of each day with someone who understands both its weight and its possibilities." The letter went on to describe his ranch, a modest operation focused more on survival than prosperity, situated in a valley where the winter winds could be fierce, but the summer evenings were soft and endless. He raised cattle primarily, with a small garden that provided vegetables for the table and hayfields that barely produced enough feed to see his animals through the harsh Colorado winters. It was, he admitted, a hard life that required constant work and offered no guarantees, but it was honest work that belonged to him rather than to mill owners or factory bosses. What struck Maggie most profoundly was his description of the landscape, painted in words that suggested a man who had learned to find beauty in stark places. He wrote of mountains that changed color with the light, of skies so vast they made a person feel both insignificant and eternal, of silence so complete it became a presence rather than an absence. For someone who had spent her entire life surrounded by the noise and smoke of industrial cities, his words opened a window into a world she could barely imagine. "I do not require a young bride or an inexperienced woman to mold according to my preferences," he continued, addressing directly the fears she had tried to hide in her own letter. "I require a partner who understands that life includes both joy and sorrow, someone who has been tested and chosen strength over surrender. Your letter suggests you are such a woman, and if you are willing to consider a life very different from what you have known, I would welcome the opportunity to continue our correspondence." He enclosed a small photograph, something Maggie hadn't expected. The image showed a tall, lean man with serious eyes and work-worn hands, standing beside a girl who barely reached his waist. Lucy had her father's serious expression, but there was something in her posture that suggested wariness rather than contentment. The careful stance of a child who had learned too young that the world could take away everything that mattered. Behind them, barely visible in the sepia tones, stood a modest house with a wide porch and mountains rising in the distance. Maggie studied the photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the reality of these two people with the dreams she'd been nurturing. Thomas Bennett was handsome in a weathered way, his face marked by sun and wind and the kind of responsibility that aged a man before his time. But there was something in his eyes that suggested reliability, the solid dependability of someone who kept his word regardless of cost. Lucy was clearly her father's daughter, with the same strong jawline and direct gaze, but there was a fragility about her that spoke to Maggie's maternal instincts. The letter concluded with a practical proposition that was somehow more romantic than any flowery declaration could have been. "If you are serious about considering this arrangement, Mrs. Sullivan, I propose we continue our correspondence through the winter months. If we find ourselves compatible in matters of temperament and expectation, I would be honored to send you train fare to come to Pine Ridge in the spring. There would be no obligation beyond giving us both the opportunity to meet face to face and determine if what we have built through letters might translate into something lasting in person." Rose found her sister still sitting with the letter an hour later, the photograph propped against the lamp and an expression of wonder on her face that hadn't been there since before James died. "Good news?" Rose asked, settling onto the edge of the bed with the familiarity of sisters who had shared everything for years. "I think so," Maggie replied, though her voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. He seems decent, honest. But Rose, it's so far away and so different from anything I know. What if I'm not strong enough for that kind of life? What if I get there and discover I'm still just a Milltown girl, playing at being something I'm not? Rose took the photograph, studying the faces of the man and child who might become her sister's new family. Look at his eyes, Maggie. Really, look at them. That's not a man who would invite someone into his life carelessly. And that little girl, she needs someone like you, someone who understands what it means to lose everything and keep going anyway. She set the photograph down carefully, treating it with the respect due to something precious. You've been strong. Enough for everything life has thrown at you so far. Why would this be different? The question hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Why would this be different? Because it was a choice rather than a circumstance thrust upon her. Because it required hope rather than mere endurance. Because for the first time in 3 years, she was being asked to move toward something instead of simply surviving where she was. That evening, Maggie began her reply, writing by lamplight, while the boarding house settled into its nightly routine around her. She accepted his proposal to continue their correspondence, and she found herself describing not just her daily life, but her dreams, the parts of herself that had been dormant since James died. She wrote about her fear of inadequacy, her worry that a woman who had failed to save her first husband might not be worthy of a second chance at partnership. Thomas's response came more quickly this time, as if he had been waiting by the post office for her letter. His words were gentle but firm, explaining that Lucy's mother had died despite the best efforts of doctors and the most devoted nursing care, that sometimes loss came regardless of love or effort or worthiness. The question, he wrote, is not whether we deserve happiness after sorrow, but whether we have the courage to reach for it when it presents itself. As December deepened and the Connecticut winter tightened its grip on Hartford, Maggie found herself living for the arrival of Thomas's letters. They came weekly now, sometimes accompanied by small sketches that Lucy had drawn, pictures of their ranch and the mountains, and occasionally a figure that might have been meant to represent Maggie herself, though the child had never seen her. The correspondence became the bright spot in days otherwise filled with the mounting pressure of unpaid bills and Mrs. Henley's increasingly frequent visits. Through their letters, Maggie learned that Thomas had been a teacher before coming west, that he had built his ranch house with his own hands, that he read to Lucy every evening from books inherited from his late wife. She learned that he worried about his daughter's silence, that he sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a girl alone, that he had grown tired of the loneliness that settled over the ranch like snow, beautiful but cold and ultimately isolating. In return, she shared her own fears and dreams, her memories of James and her hopes for the future, her growing conviction that she was meant for something more than slow starvation in a boarding house that would never be truly hers. With each letter, the distance between Hartford and Pine Ridge seemed to shrink, replaced by an intimacy built on mutual honesty and the shared understanding that both of them were looking for a second chance at the life they'd thought was over. Part 4. The Courage Declaration. By January, the correspondence between Maggie and Thomas had developed a rhythm as reliable as the seasons, his letters arriving each Tuesday and hers departing each Thursday, creating a bridge of words across the vast distance that separated their worlds. The boarding house continued its slow decline around her, but Maggie found herself less concerned with Mrs. Henley's increasingly stern warnings and more focused on the growing certainty that her future lay somewhere other than Hartford. The decision crystallized on a bitter February morning when she woke to find ice coating the inside of her bedroom windows and Mr. Peterson coughing blood into his handkerchief at the breakfast table. The mill workers were striking again, this time over safety conditions that had already claimed 3 lives since Christmas. and half her boarders were talking about moving west themselves, following rumors of work in Colorado's silver mines and Wyoming's cattle ranches. "The whole world is moving, Maggie," Rose observed as they cleaned up after another breakfast where more food was left on plates than eaten. The men too worried about their jobs to have much appetite. "Maybe it's time we moved with it instead of standing still and watching everything crumble around us." The letter from Thomas that arrived that afternoon seemed to carry an unusual urgency, though his words remained characteristically measured. "Lucy had been asking about the lady from the letters," he wrote, "had begun including small drawings, clearly meant for Maggie, in her evening art sessions. More importantly, Thomas had been making inquiries about train schedules and discovered that the spring routes would begin running to Colorado in early April, weather permitting. I do not wish to press you for a decision before you are ready," he continued, "but I find myself hoping that you might consider making the journey this spring rather than waiting another year. Lucy and I have grown accustomed to thinking of you as part of our lives, and the winter months have convinced me that partnership, when it is based on mutual respect and shared understanding, should not be postponed unnecessarily." Enclosed with his letter was something Maggie hadn't expected, a bank draft for $50 made out in her name. "For travel expenses," his note explained, "with no obligation except to give us all the chance to discover what we might build together. If you decide we would not suit, the money is yours to use for whatever future you choose. But I hope, Mrs. Sullivan, that you will choose to come to Colorado." Maggie stared at the bank draft for a long time, understanding that it represented more than money. It was trust, offered by a man who had never seen her face, who knew her only through carefully written letters and the photograph she had finally sent after Christmas. It was opportunity, the chance to step out of the slowly closing trap of her Hartford life and into something unknown but potentially wonderful. Most of all, it was hope, tangible and negotiable, something she could hold in her hands and feel the weight of. That evening, she called Rose into her room and showed her both the letter and the bank draft. Her sister's eyes widened at the sight of more money than they typically saw in 2 months, but her expression remained thoughtful rather than excited. $50, Rose murmured, turning the draft over in her hands. "That's a fortune to people like us, but it's also a commitment. He's not just inviting you to visit, Maggie. He's investing in the possibility that you'll stay." The weight of that investment settled over Maggie like a mantle, heavy with responsibility, but also strangely liberating. For 3 years, she had been the recipient of charity, however grudgingly given, the object of pity and concern and barely concealed disapproval. Now, for the first time since James died, someone was offering her not assistance but partnership, not rescue, but the chance to rescue herself. "I'm going to write to him tonight," she said finally, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm going to tell him yes, that I'll come to Colorado in April." The words felt strange in her mouth, like a foreign language she was learning to speak, but they also felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for years. Rose smiled, the first genuine smile Maggie had seen from her sister in months. "Good," she said simply. "It's time one of us had the chance to find out what happens when you choose hope over safety." There was no jealousy in her voice, only the fierce satisfaction of someone who had watched a loved one suffer and was finally seeing them reach for healing. The letter Maggie wrote that night was different from all the others, charged with decision and commitment rather than careful exploration. She accepted Thomas's invitation formally, promising to arrive in Pine Ridge by the middle of April if the trains were running on schedule. She wrote about her excitement and her terror, her gratitude for his trust, and her determination to prove they're worthy of it. She wrote about Rose, about the boarding house, about the life she would be leaving behind, not with regret, but with the recognition that some chapters must end before new ones can begin. "I am not coming to you as a desperate woman seeking rescue," she concluded, "but as a partner ready to share both the burdens and the joys of the life we might build together. If that is what you seek, Mr. Bennett, then I am prepared to offer you everything I have learned about endurance, about hope, and about the courage it takes to begin again." The response came faster than any previous letter, as if Thomas had been waiting by the post office with his reply already written. His joy came through in every carefully controlled line, his relief that she had accepted mixed with practical concerns about her comfort during the long journey west. He had already spoken to the station master about the best routes and had arranged for her to break her journey in Kansas City, where the wife of his brother-in-law would meet her train and provide a night's lodging before the final push to Colorado. More touching than his logistical preparations were the small details that revealed how completely he had imagined her arrival. Lucy, he wrote, had already begun preparing what would be Maggie's room, had picked wildflowers to press between the pages of books so that the space would smell of growing things rather than dust and loneliness. He had ordered new curtains from the general store and had begun planning improvements to the house that would make it more comfortable for a woman accustomed to city conveniences. "We are ready for you, Mrs. Sullivan," he concluded, "in all ways that matter. Come to us when you can, and we will show you what it means to be truly welcome." As March arrived with its promises of spring and renewal, Maggie began the process of extracting herself from her Hartford life. She sold most of her furniture to pay outstanding debts, keeping only her mother's china and a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to James. She arranged for Rose to take over the boarding house, entirely with the understanding that whatever remained after the bank claimed its due would belong to her sister alone. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the woman who had stood by her through the worst years of her life, who had shared both poverty and hope without complaint. On her last morning in Hartford, the sisters sat together in the kitchen where they had planned so many small economies and weathered so many small crises, drinking coffee that had been stretched with chicory and eating bread that Rose had somehow made taste better than it had any right to. "You'll write," Rose said, and it wasn't a question. "You'll tell me about the mountains and the sky and whether that little girl smiles when she sees you." "I'll write," Maggie promised, "and when I'm settled, when I know it's going to work, I'll send for you if you want to come. There's room in that big country for both of us, if you're willing to trade mill smoke for mountain air." Rose's eyes brightened at the possibility, but she shook her head. "This is your adventure, sister mine, but knowing you're happy will be enough to make my own life brighter." She paused, then added with characteristic practicality, "Besides, someone needs to stay here to make sure Mrs. Henley doesn't foreclose on the boarding house before I can make it profitable again." The train whistle that had marked the rhythm of Maggie's days for 26 years called out one final time as her personal herald, announcing not another day of industrial routine, but the beginning of a journey towards something she could barely imagine. As she settled into her seat and watched Hartford recede through the window, Maggie felt the weight of her old life lifting from her shoulders, replaced by the lighter but more vital burden of hope fulfilled and courage rewarded. Then Part 5, The Mirror Soul Introduction. 2,000 miles away, in a valley where the morning light turned the surrounding peaks to gold and the evening shadows painted them purple, Thomas Bennett stood on his front porch and watched his daughter scatter feed for the chickens with the methodical precision she brought to all her tasks. Lucy had inherited her mother's careful nature along with her dark hair and serious eyes, but where Sarah had been careful from love, Lucy was careful from fear, moving through her daily routines like someone afraid that any deviation might bring disaster. The ranch spread around them in all directions, modest by Colorado standards, but vast compared to anything Maggie would have known in Connecticut. The house itself was solidly built, but unpretentious, constructed from logs that Thomas had cut and shaped himself during his first winter in the territory. It sat in a natural clearing surrounded by stands of pine and aspen, with the barn and outbuildings arranged in a practical pattern that spoke of a man who valued efficiency over aesthetics. Thomas had built this life piece by piece, arriving in Colorado territory with little more than hope and determination, working first as a ranch hand for other men before accumulating enough capital to purchase his own land. The work had been hard, harder than teaching school back in Illinois, but it had been honest work that left him tired in his bones rather than tired in his soul. Here, success or failure depended on his own efforts rather than the whims of school, boards, or the politics of small-town hierarchies. The first years had been good ones. Sarah had adapted to ranch life with the same quiet competence she had brought to managing their household back east, and Lucy had thrived in the freedom of wide-open spaces and endless sky. They had been happy, not in the breathless way of new romance, but in the deep, sustaining way of two people who had found their proper place in the world and were content to build something lasting together. Sarah's illness had come slowly at first, just a cough that wouldn't clear, and a fatigue that seemed reasonable given the demands of ranch life. By the time they understood the seriousness of her condition, the consumption had already taken hold, too firmly to be dislodged by mountain air and wishful thinking. The nearest doctor was 50 miles away in Denver, and his visits became increasingly frequent and increasingly futile as Sarah grew thinner and weaker despite every effort to save her. Lucy had watched her mother fade with the terrible comprehension of a child who understands more than adults want to believe. She had stopped chattering about her drawings, stopped asking endless questions about the world around them, stopped bringing Thomas wildflower bouquets and smooth stones she found by the creek. The silence that had settled over her after Sarah's death was not the quiet of contentment, but the hush of someone afraid that making noise might attract more tragedy. For 2 years, Thomas had told himself that time would heal his daughter's wounds, that the resilience of childhood would eventually reassert itself and bring back the laughter that had once filled their home. But as months passed without significant change, he began to understand that Lucy's silence was not a temporary response to grief, but a fundamental alteration in her understanding of how the world worked. She had learned too young that love was fragile, that happiness was temporary, that the people you counted on could be taken away without warning or reason. The decision to seek a wife through correspondence had been born not from loneliness, though Thomas was certainly lonely, but from the growing recognition that Lucy needed to see that life could still hold joy, that new people could enter their world without inevitably leaving it. A woman who had already experienced loss and chosen to risk love again might be exactly what his daughter needed to believe that opening her heart was worth the potential pain. Thomas's brother Sam had been skeptical of the plan, arguing that any decent woman would expect courtship and romance rather than the practical arrangement Thomas seemed to be proposing. But Sam, for all his good intentions, had never been married, had never understood that the deepest partnerships were built on shared understanding rather than passionate declarations. What Thomas sought was not a bride, but a partner, someone who would see the ranch and the life it offered clearly, without romantic illusions or unrealistic expectations. The letters from Margaret Sullivan had exceeded his hopes in every way that mattered. Her honesty about her circumstances and her motivations had convinced him that she was not a woman seeking rescue, but one seeking opportunity. Her questions about ranch life and Colorado weather showed practical intelligence rather than romantic fantasy. Most importantly, her willingness to acknowledge her own grief while still reaching toward the future suggested exactly the kind of strength that Lucy needed to witness. As March progressed toward April and the time of Maggie's arrival drew closer, Thomas found himself making preparations that went beyond the practical necessities of housing and feeding a new member of their household. He cleaned and organized with an attention to detail that would have amused Sarah, who had often teased him about his tendency to let small domestic matters slide in favor of more pressing ranch work. He repaired loose boards and squeaky hinges, whitewashed walls that had grown dingy through winter, and even planted a small flower garden beside the front porch. Lucy watched these preparations with the careful attention she brought to everything, saying nothing, but clearly understanding that significant change was approaching their quiet world. Thomas tried to gauge her feelings about the coming arrival, but his daughter had become expert at revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. She nodded when he told her that Mrs. Sullivan would be coming to stay with them, asked no questions when he explained that the lady might become her new mother if they all got along well together, showed no emotion when he mentioned that having another woman in the house would mean changes to their established routines. "She writes nice letters," was Lucy's only comment, delivered with the same neutral tone she used to observe that the chickens had laid well or that storm clouds were gathering over the mountains. Thomas treasured even this minimal response, understanding that for Lucy, acknowledging anything positive about their situation represented a significant emotional risk. The photograph Maggie had finally sent showed a woman who looked older than her 26 years, her face marked by the kind of experience that aged a person prematurely, but also gave them substance and depth. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that magazine illustrations suggested women should be, but there was something in her direct gaze and slight smile that suggested both warmth and strength. Thomas found himself studying the photograph, often trying to reconcile the woman in the image with the voice that came through her letters, the personality that had become so real to him over the months of their correspondence. What struck him most about both the photograph and the letters was Maggie's complete lack of pretense. She did not present herself as younger or more accomplished than she was, did not make promises she might not be able to keep, did not try to convince him that she was anything other than what she claimed to be. In a world where courtship was often based on careful deception and strategic presentation, her honesty was both refreshing and reassuring. The final letter before her departure had carried a different tone, charged with decision and commitment, that made Thomas understand that she was not simply visiting Colorado, but moving toward a complete transformation of her life. The courage required for such a leap impressed him deeply, reminding him of his own decision to leave Illinois and try to build something new in the wilderness. Anyone willing to risk so much for the possibility of happiness was exactly the kind of person he wanted as a partner in the uncertain enterprise of creating a life worth living. As April arrived with its promise of new growth and fresh beginnings, Thomas found himself thinking not just about Maggie's arrival, but about the family they might become together. Lucy needed to see that love was possible without loss, that new people could enter their lives and stay, that the silence that had protected her from further hurt might also be protecting her from future joy. If Maggie Sullivan was the woman her letters suggested she was, her presence might be exactly what was needed to convince his daughter that the world still held possibilities worth exploring. Standing on his porch in the morning light, watching Lucy tend to her chores with careful efficiency, Thomas allowed himself to hope that the woman traveling toward them across the vast distance of the American continent would prove to be not just a wife for him, but a mother for his daughter. Not just a solution to their loneliness, but a partner in building the kind of life that could withstand whatever storms the future might bring. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, delivered by young Billy Morrison, who rode the 20-mile circuit between Pine Ridge and the surrounding ranches twice weekly. Thomas had been mending fence posts when he saw the boy's horse kicking up dust clouds along the valley road, and something about the urgency of the rider's approach made him set down his tools and walk toward the house with a growing sense of unease. Lucy was hanging laundry on the line behind the kitchen, her small hands working with the same methodical care she brought to every task, when Billy's horse thundered into the yard. She looked up at the sound, her dark eyes registering the unusual midweek arrival, but showing none of the curiosity that would have animated her face in earlier times. Instead, she simply continued pinning sheets to the line while keeping one ear turned toward the conversation taking place near the front porch. "Telegram for Thomas Bennett," Billy announced, dismounting with the theatrical flourish of a boy who understood the drama inherent in his role as bearer of distant news. He was 14 years old and took his responsibilities as circuit rider seriously, knowing that in a territory where neighbors lived miles apart, he often carried the only communication that connected isolated homesteads to the wider world. Thomas accepted the yellow envelope with hands that had suddenly grown unsteady, recognizing the return address of the Western Union office in Kansas City. Telegrams, in his experience, brought news that couldn't wait for letters, which usually meant news that no one wanted to receive. His first thought was of his brother back in Illinois, his second of some catastrophe that might have befallen Maggie. During her journey west, the message inside was brief, as telegrams always were, each word carrying a cost that encouraged economy of expression. Delayed Kansas City stop, father ill Hartford stop, may need return stop, writing with details stop. M. Sullivan. Thomas read the words twice, understanding immediately that the careful plans they had made were now subject to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Billy waited while Thomas absorbed the news, his young face showing the kind of sympathetic curiosity that came from delivering messages to people whose lives were suddenly complicated by distant events. "Bad news, Mr. Bennett?" he asked finally, his tone suggesting he was prepared to offer whatever comfort a 14-year-old boy could provide to a grown man facing disappointment. "Uncertain news," Thomas replied carefully, folding the telegram and slipping it into his shirt pocket. "Mrs. Sullivan may be delayed in her arrival. Family matters back east." He spoke the words aloud, partly to inform Billy, who would certainly spread the news throughout Pine Ridge, but mostly to help himself accept the reality that months of anticipation might now come to nothing. After Billy departed with promises to check for any additional messages during his next circuit, Thomas sat alone on his front porch and tried to make sense of the emotions churning in his chest. Disappointment was certainly present, sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something more complex. Relief, perhaps, that the decision had been taken out of his hands, that he wouldn't have to discover whether the woman he had come to care about through letters could translate into someone he could live with in person. But stronger than relief was worry, not for himself, but for Maggie, who must be facing an agonizing choice between loyalty to family and commitment to her own future. He had learned enough about her circumstances through their correspondence to understand that returning to Hartford would mean accepting defeat, abandoning the possibility of independence in favor of whatever charity her relatives might provide. Yet he also understood that duty to family, particularly to aging parents, was not something any decent person could ignore without consequence. Lucy appeared around the corner of the house, having finished her laundry duties, and settled onto the porch steps with the sketchbook that had become her constant companion. She opened it to a fresh page and began drawing what appeared to be the mountains in the distance, but Thomas noticed that her usual concentration seemed forced, as if she were using the activity to avoid conversation rather than from genuine interest in capturing the landscape. "The lady from Connecticut may not come after all," Thomas said finally, deciding that honesty was preferable to allowing his daughter to wonder about the sudden change in household atmosphere. "Her father is ill, and she may need to stay in Hartford to care for him." Lucy's pencil stopped moving across the paper, though she didn't look up from her drawing. For several minutes, the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the pine trees that surrounded their clearing. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that Thomas had to lean forward to hear her words. "Mama got sick and didn't get better," she said, still focused on her sketchbook. "Maybe her papa will get better and she can come later." The same words were delivered without emotion, as if she were commenting on the weather. But Thomas understood that his daughter was trying to process the concept of illness and obligation in terms of her own experience with loss. "Maybe," Thomas agreed, though he privately doubted that Maggie would be able to make the journey later if family duty called her back to Hartford now. People who returned to situations they had tried to escape rarely found the courage to attempt escape twice. "Would you be disappointed if she didn't come?" Lucy considered the question with the serious attention she gave to all inquiries that required her to reveal something of her inner thoughts. "I made her a drawing," she said finally, "of our house and the mountains. I was going to give it to her when she got here." She turned to a page earlier in her sketchbook and showed Thomas a carefully detailed illustration of their ranch house, complete with the flower garden he had planted and the swing he had built beneath the old cottonwood tree. The drawing was remarkable not just for its technical skill, which had improved dramatically over the past year, but for the sense of welcome it conveyed. Lucy had drawn the house as she had never drawn it before, with smoke curling cheerfully from the chimney and wildflowers blooming in abundance around the foundation. It was their home, as seen through the eyes of someone eager to share it, rather than the careful documentation of familiar surroundings that characterized most of her artistic efforts. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, and meant it. "Mrs. Sullivan would treasure such a gift." He paused, studying his daughter's face for any sign of the emotion he knew must be present beneath her carefully controlled exterior. "You were looking forward to meeting her." "She writes about books," Lucy replied, which was not exactly an answer, but was more revelation than she usually provided. "In her letters, she talks about stories and poems. Mama used to read me stories." The connection was left unspoken but clear. Maggie represented the possibility of restoring something that had been lost when Sarah died. A connection to the world of words and imagination that had been such an important part of Lucy's early childhood. That evening, as father and daughter sat together in their customary silence, Thomas found himself thinking about the patterns of loss that seemed to define so many lives. He had lost Sarah to illness beyond anyone's control. Maggie had lost her husband in an industrial accident that might have been prevented with better safety measures. Lucy had lost her mother, and with her the sense of security that allowed children to believe the world was fundamentally safe. Now, all of them faced the possibility of losing something else, the chance at healing that their planned reunion had represented. The letter that arrived 3 days later provided the details that the telegram had promised, and they were every bit as complicated as Thomas had feared. Maggie's father had suffered what the Hartford doctor described as an apoplectic fit, leaving him partially paralyzed and in need of constant care. Her mother, never strong and now overwhelmed by the demands of nursing, had collapsed under the strain and taken to her bed with nervous exhaustion. Rose, who had been managing the boarding house alone, was now attempting to care for both parents, while maintaining the income that kept the family from complete destitution. "I find myself torn between two impossible choices," Maggie wrote, her usual careful script showing signs of the stress under which it had been composed. "My family needs me desperately, and duty demands that I remain to provide what care I can. Yet I know that staying means accepting a life of slow decline, watching my parents fade while my own hopes wither from neglect. I have tasted the possibility of a different future, and I cannot pretend that I do not long for it still." She went on to describe the guilt that consumed her whenever she thought of abandoning her family in their hour of greatest need, but also the despair that threatened to overwhelm her when she contemplated spending the rest of her life as an unpaid nurse and housekeeper, her own dreams sacrificed to the endless demands of duty. The woman who had written so confidently about choosing hope over safety now found herself caught between competing obligations, each with its own moral weight. "I do not ask you to wait for me," her letter continued, "for I cannot say when, if ever, I might be free to make the journey to Colorado. You have your own life to live and your daughter to consider, and both deserve better than indefinite postponement of happiness. If you choose to correspond with another woman, I will understand completely and wish you both every blessing." But even as she released him from their informal engagement, Maggie revealed the depth of her feelings in words that cut straight to Thomas's heart. "I want you to know that our correspondence has been the brightest part of my life these past months. That the possibility of building something with you and Lucy has sustained me through difficulties I might not otherwise have survived. Whatever happens now, I will always be grateful for the hope you gave me when I had forgotten what hope felt like." Thomas read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, understanding that he was facing his own impossible choice. He could accept Maggie's release and begin the process of finding another potential wife, someone who might be available immediately and without the complications of distant family obligations. Or he could wait, knowing that waiting might mean losing the chance for Lucy to have a mother during the years when such influence mattered most, but also knowing that rushing into an arrangement with someone else would mean abandoning the woman who had already claimed a place in both their hearts. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed with her sketchbook tucked under her arm as always, Thomas sat at his kitchen table and tried to compose a response that would somehow bridge the distance between duty and desire, between practical necessity and emotional truth. The words came slowly, each one weighed against his understanding of Maggie's situation and his own needs. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan," he finally wrote, "your letter reveals the character that first drew me to correspond with you, the same strength and selflessness that convinced me you would be an ideal partner in both marriage and parenthood. That you struggle with this decision proves not weakness, but the depth of your compassion, and I would think less of you if you could abandon family duty without such anguish." He went on to explain that he had no intention of seeking correspondence with another woman, that Lucy had already made room in her heart for the lady from Connecticut, and that both of them were prepared to wait as long as necessary for circumstances to change. "Duty is a hard master," he continued, "but it is not always a permanent one. Parents age and pass on, situations change, new possibilities emerge. If there is any chance that you might someday be free to make the journey west, we will be here, waiting for you." The letter concluded with an offer that surprised Thomas, even as he made it, born from an understanding of desperation that came from his own experience with loss and difficult choices. "If your family's financial situation is part of what keeps you bound to Hartford, please know that I would be honored to provide whatever assistance might ease their circumstances. A man who hopes to gain a wife and daughter through your courage should be willing to invest in the family that shaped you, and money spent to preserve the possibility of our future together would be money well invested." As he sealed the letter and prepared it for Billy Morrison's next circuit, Thomas realized that he had committed himself not just to waiting for Maggie, but to supporting her family from a distance, to becoming involved in lives he had never seen for the sake of a woman he had never met. It was either the action of a fool or the action of a man who understood that true partnership sometimes required sacrifice before it could flourish. The weeks that followed brought a regular correspondence that was different in tone from their earlier exchanges. less focused on the future they hoped to build together and more concerned with the daily struggles that kept them apart. Maggie wrote about small improvements in her father's condition, about her mother's gradual recovery, about Rose's determination to keep the boarding house profitable, despite the additional burdens placed upon it. Thomas wrote about spring planting and cattle births, about Lucy's continued artistic development and her quiet but persistent questions about when the lady might finally come to visit. Through it all, both of them learned something about the nature of commitment that their earlier courtship had only suggested. Love, they discovered, was not just the desire to be together, but the willingness to sacrifice being together for the sake of larger obligations. Trust was not just believing in someone's intentions, but accepting that those intentions might be defeated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Hope was not just expecting the best possible outcome, but continuing to build toward that outcome, even when its arrival seemed indefinitely postponed. Part 7. The Bridge Building. Summer arrived in Colorado with a burst of wildflowers that painted the mountain meadows in shades of purple, yellow, and white. But for Thomas and Lucy, the season brought more anticipation than celebration. The regular exchange of letters with Maggie had established a rhythm that made her feel like part of their family, despite the 2,000 miles that separated them. Yet the uncertainty of when, if ever, she might actually make the journey west cast a shadow over even the most beautiful days. Lucy's behavior had begun to change in subtle ways that Thomas initially attributed to the natural development of a growing child. She had started speaking more frequently, though still far from the chatterbox she had been before her mother's death, and her drawings had taken on a more hopeful quality. The careful documentation of familiar surroundings had given way to illustrations that seemed designed to show, rather than simply record, pictures that appeared intended for an audience. Beyond herself and her father, the breakthrough came on a warm July evening, when Lucy approached Thomas with a request that took him completely by surprise. "I want to write a letter to Mrs. Sullivan," she announced, settling beside him on the front porch with her writing materials already in hand. "I want to tell her about the things I draw and ask her about the books she reads." Thomas studied his daughter's face, searching for any sign that this sudden desire for communication was born from duty rather than genuine interest. What he saw instead was the first real animation he had witnessed from Lucy in over 2 years, a spark of curiosity and engagement that reminded him powerfully of the little girl who had once peppered him with endless questions about everything, from cloud formations to the reasons why chickens couldn't fly. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said carefully, not wanting to overwhelm her fragile initiative with too much enthusiasm. "Mrs. Sullivan has mentioned in her letters how much she would enjoy hearing from you directly." Lucy nodded seriously and bent over her paper, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in the way that had always indicated deep concentration. Thomas watched her work, marveling at the careful formation of letters that had improved dramatically over the past months, evidence of practice sessions he hadn't been aware she was conducting. When she had finished, she handed him the paper for inspection, her expression anxious but determined. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan," the letter began, "Papa reads me your letters and I like the parts about books and stories. I draw pictures of our ranch for you to see when you come here. Do you like to draw too? I drew our house with flowers like Papa. Planted, and I hope you will like them. I hope your papa gets better soon so you can come see us. Your friend, Lucy Bennett." The simplicity of the letter moved Thomas more than any elaborate composition could have, representing as it did his daughter's first voluntary attempt to reach beyond the protective silence she had maintained since her mother's death. More importantly, it revealed that Lucy had been listening carefully to all the letters Thomas had read aloud, that she had been forming her own relationship with the woman who might someday become her stepmother. When Maggie's response arrived 3 weeks later, it included a separate envelope addressed specifically to Lucy in the careful script that had become familiar to both father and daughter. Lucy accepted the letter with visible excitement, the first strong emotion Thomas had seen her display in months, and disappeared into her room to read it privately. She emerged an hour later with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face, clutching the letter as if it contained precious treasure. "She likes my drawings," Lucy announced, her voice thick with emotion she was struggling to contain. She said, "They make her feel like she can see our home even from so far away. And she's going to send me a book of stories about children who have adventures." The transformation in his daughter's demeanor was so dramatic that Thomas felt his own eyes growing damp, understanding that Maggie had somehow managed to reach across the vast distance and touch the part of Lucy that had been locked away since Sarah's death. The correspondence between Lucy and Maggie quickly developed its own character, distinct from the adult concerns that dominated the letters between Thomas and his intended bride. Lucy wrote about her daily observations of ranch life, her attempts to capture the changing seasons in her drawings, her memories of her mother that she felt safe sharing with someone who had also experienced loss. Maggie responded with stories about her own childhood, descriptions of Connecticut seasons and city life, and most importantly, book recommendations that arrived by mail with regularity. Through the summer and into early autumn, the three-way correspondence created a sense of family connection that transcended physical separation. Thomas found himself looking forward not just to his own letters from Maggie, but to watching Lucy's face light up when her own correspondence arrived. The house gradually filled with the books Maggie sent, creating a small library that became Lucy's favorite retreat, and providing endless topics for the letters she now wrote with enthusiasm rather than duty. The turning point came in late September when a letter from Maggie arrived that carried news none of them had dared to hope for. Her father's condition had stabilized to the point where he no longer required constant nursing care, and her mother had recovered sufficiently to resume many of her household duties. More importantly, Rose had received an offer of marriage from a widowed mill supervisor who was willing to take responsibility for both the boarding house and the care of Maggie's parents. "I find myself in the unexpected position of being needed less rather than more," Maggie wrote, her excitement evident in script that was less careful than usual. "Rose's intended husband is a good man who understands the obligations he would be taking on, and he has assured me that my parents would be welcome in his household for as long as they require care. For the first time in months, I can see a future in which duty and desire might be reconciled rather than set in opposition." She went on to explain that Rose's wedding was planned for early November, after which the new arrangement would be tested to ensure its sustainability. If all went well, Maggie hoped to make the journey to Colorado in the spring, finally free to pursue the life she had dreamed of throughout the long months of separation and uncertainty. The letter included a separate note for Lucy, who read it with growing excitement before sharing its contents with her father. "She says she's going to bring all the books we've talked about," Lucy announced, "and she wants to learn to draw pictures like I do. She says maybe we can sit together and draw the mountains while she tells me stories about the places she's lived." That evening, as father and daughter sat together on their front porch, watching the first snow of the season dust the distant peaks, Thomas felt something shift in the atmosphere around them. The waiting that had characterized the past months no longer felt like postponement, but like preparation. Not just for Maggie's arrival, but for the kind of family they might become together. "Do you think you'll like having Mrs. Sullivan as your mama?" he asked Lucy, who was sketching the snow-covered mountains in the last light of day. Lucy considered the question with her usual seriousness before responding. "I think she already feels like family," she said finally, Her letters sound like Mama's voice when she used to read me stories. Different words, but the same feeling. She paused, then added with sudden intensity, I want her to come home now. I want to show her all the places I've drawn for her. The word home hung in the evening air, simple but profound in its implications. Lucy had begun to think of Maggie not as a visitor who might someday arrive, but as a missing member of their family who belonged with them in the place they had built together. The months of correspondence had accomplished what Thomas had hoped, for but had hardly dared to expect. They had created genuine love and connection across distance and uncertainty. As winter settled over the Colorado Valley and the correspondence continued its steady rhythm, Thomas found himself planning not just for Maggie's eventual arrival, but for the family they would become once she was finally able to make the journey west. The house that had felt too quiet since Sarah's death now seemed to echo with possibility, filled with the promise of voices and laughter and the kind of daily intimacy that transformed mere survival into genuine living. The books that arrived, regularly from Connecticut, created a bridge between their worlds, each volume carefully chosen to introduce Lucy to new ideas and adventures while maintaining the connection she had established with her future stepmother. More importantly, they represented Maggie's investment in a relationship that existed only on paper but had become more real to all of them than many connections based on daily proximity. By Christmas, the correspondence had evolved into something that felt less like courtship and more like the ongoing communication of a family temporarily separated by circumstances beyond their control. They shared daily concerns and small victories, sought each other's advice on practical matters, and planned for a future that felt increasingly certain despite the continued uncertainty about timing. The presents that arrived from Connecticut that Christmas were carefully chosen to reflect the relationships that had developed through months of letters. For Thomas, Maggie sent a book of poetry by authors she particularly enjoyed, along with a note explaining that she looked forward to reading aloud to him in the evenings once they were finally together. For Lucy, she sent art supplies and a collection of fairy tales with detailed illustrations, understanding that both the stories and the pictures would appeal to a child who experienced the world through both words and images. Lucy's gift to Maggie was a carefully crafted sketchbook filled with drawings of their ranch through all the seasons, each illustration accompanied by a short note explaining what she wanted to share with her future mother when they were finally able to meet face to face. The final drawing showed 3 figures standing together on their front porch, with "Welcome Home" written in Lucy's careful script at the bottom of the page. As 1893 dawned cold and clear over the Colorado mountains, Thomas felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with Maggie's physical presence and everything to do with the emotional bonds that had been forged through months of patient correspondence. They had become a family through words on paper, creating connections that would need only physical presence to transform them from possibility into reality. Part 8. The Secret Preparation. The final letter that would determine their future arrived on a bitter February morning when the snow lay 3 feet deep around the ranch house and the nearest road was impassable except on horseback. Billy Morrison had made the journey from Pine Ridge on skis, his dedication to his postal route evident in the frost coating his eyebrows and the determined set of his jaw as he handed over the precious bundle of correspondence that represented the outside world's only connection to their isolated valley. Thomas accepted the letters with hands that shook slightly, not from cold but from anticipation, recognizing immediately the thick envelope that bore Maggie's familiar script and understanding that this communication would likely contain the decision they had all been waiting for through the long months of winter. Lucy appeared at his elbow, drawn by some instinct that told her this moment was different from all the routine deliveries that had punctuated their correspondence. inside the house, with the envelope opened and its contents spread across the kitchen table, Thomas read aloud the words that would reshape their lives. Rose's marriage had proven successful beyond everyone's expectations, with her new husband proving both capable of managing the boarding house and genuinely devoted to the welfare of his wife's extended family. Maggie's parents had settled comfortably into their new arrangement. Her father's health had continued to improve, and her mother had found in her new son-in-law the support she needed to reclaim her own life. "I am finally free to make the journey I have dreamed of for so long," Maggie wrote, her joy evident in every carefully formed word. "Rose insists that she no longer needs my assistance. My parents are well settled in their new circumstances, and I find myself for the first time since James died with no obligations except to my own future happiness. If your invitation still stands, I would like to arrive in Pine Ridge by the middle of May, when the spring weather should make travel more reliable." The letter went on to detail practical arrangements, train schedules, and financial considerations. But Thomas found it difficult to focus on logistics when his mind was reeling with the reality that their long separation was finally coming to an end. Beside him, Lucy was reading her own letter from Maggie, her face glowing with an excitement that transformed her features and reminded Thomas powerfully of the animated child she had been before grief changed her. "She's really coming," Lucy whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow jinx the wonderful news. "She says she's bringing all the books we've talked about, and fabric to make new curtains, and a camera so she can take pictures of our ranch to send back to her sister." The practical details seemed to make Maggie's arrival more real than all the months of letters had managed to accomplish, transforming abstract possibility into concrete plans. That afternoon, despite the deep snow and bitter cold, Thomas found himself walking the boundaries of his property with new eyes, seeing everything as Maggie would see it when she finally arrived. The ranch that had served adequately for a widower and his quiet daughter suddenly seemed in need of improvements, upgrades that would make their home worthy of a woman who had given up everything familiar to join her life to theirs. The list of necessary preparations grew longer with each passing day, as Thomas considered everything from the practical necessity of enlarging the root cellar to store additional food supplies to the more aesthetic concerns of repairing the front gate and painting the barn that had weathered to a dull gray over the winter months. Lucy contributed her own suggestions, pointing out areas where flower gardens might be planted and rooms that could benefit from better lighting for evening reading sessions. As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared in the valley, father and daughter threw themselves into a frenzy of activity that transformed both the ranch and their relationship to it. Thomas discovered that having a specific goal and deadline focused his efforts in ways that routine maintenance never had, while Lucy found herself genuinely excited about domestic projects for the first time since her mother's death. The house received the most attention, with every room being thoroughly cleaned, repaired, and updated, according to standards that Thomas hoped would meet the expectations of a woman accustomed to more civilized living conditions. The bedroom that would become Maggie's was painted in soft yellow, chosen because Lucy remembered from one of the letters that yellow was Maggie's favorite color. New curtains were ordered from the general store in Pine Ridge, along with a wash basin and picture set that seemed more appropriate for a lady than the utilitarian fixtures that had served Thomas and Lucy adequately. The kitchen, which would become the heart of their family life, received particular attention. Thomas installed new shelving to accommodate the increased cooking and storage needs that would come with a third member of the household, while Lucy contributed her artistic talents to creating decorative touches that would make the space more welcoming. She painted small wildflower designs around the window frames and created a set of place cards for the kitchen table that spelled out Thomas, Lucy, and Margaret in careful script, surrounded by tiny illustrations of mountain landscapes. Outside, the preparations were equally extensive. Thomas repaired fences that had suffered winter damage, cleared brush from areas that would become vegetable gardens, and even constructed a small gazebo near the creek where Maggie might sit. To read or write letters back to her family in Connecticut, Lucy insisted on planting wildflower seeds in areas visible from the house windows, explaining that she wanted Maggie's first view of their home to include the kind of colorful beauty that would make her feel welcome. The livestock received attention as well, with Thomas purchasing additional chickens to ensure a reliable supply of eggs and acquiring a gentle mare that would provide Maggie with transportation around the ranch once she learned to ride. He spent hours training the mare to be responsive to inexperienced handling, understanding that a woman who had lived her entire life in cities would need time to become comfortable with large animals. As spring progressed towards summer and Maggie's arrival date approached, the correspondence between Colorado and Connecticut took on an increasingly excited tone. Maggie wrote detailed descriptions of her travel preparations, her growing excitement about finally seeing the landscape that had been described to her in so many letters, and her nervousness about meeting in person the people who had become so important to her through written communication. Lucy's letters to her future stepmother became daily reports on the preparations being made for her arrival, complete with small sketches showing the improvements to the house and grounds. She wrote about the flower gardens beginning to bloom, the new books that had arrived for their shared library, and her own growing impatience to finally meet the woman who had become such an important part of her life, despite their continued physical separation. Thomas found himself writing not just about practical arrangements, but about his own emotional preparation for Maggie's arrival. The months of correspondence had created expectations and assumptions that would now be tested against reality, and he wanted to be honest about both his hopes and his concerns. Would the woman who stepped off the train in Pine Ridge match the person he had come to know through letters? Would the life he could offer her prove sufficient compensation for everything she was giving up to join him? The final weeks before Maggie's departure from Connecticut brought a flurry of letters that served to finalize arrangements while also expressing the emotions that had been building throughout their long separation. Thomas sent detailed instructions for the journey west, including the names of reliable hotels where she could safely spend the nights required by such an extended trip, while Maggie wrote about her excitement and terror in equal measure. "I find myself alternately thrilled and terrified," she confessed in one of her final letters from Hartford. "Thrilled by the prospect of finally meeting you and Lucy face to face, of seeing the mountains and sky you have described so beautifully, of beginning the life we have planned together through so many letters, but also terrified that I may disappoint you both, that the reality of Margaret Sullivan may not live up to the expectations created by her correspondence." Thomas's response was immediate and heartfelt, addressing fears that he understood because he shared them. "We all three face the same uncertainty," he wrote, "the same risk that reality may not match our hopes. But we also share the same foundation of genuine affection and respect that has grown from months of honest communication. Whatever adjustments may be necessary when we finally meet, we will make them together as a family." The last letter Lucy wrote to Maggie before her departure contained a simple but profound promise that touched Thomas deeply when his daughter shared it with him. "I have been practicing being happy again," she wrote, "because I want to be ready to smile when I see you for the first time. Mama used to say that the best welcome gift you can give someone is your own joy, and I want to give you the biggest welcome gift I can." As May arrived with its promise of new growth and fresh beginnings, Thomas and Lucy made their final preparations not just for Maggie's arrival, but for the transformation of their quiet ranch into a true family home. The months of waiting and planning had changed them both, giving them purpose beyond mere survival and hope beyond simple endurance. Soon, the woman who had sustained them through letters would finally join them in person, and they would all discover whether the family they had created on paper could become the family they would live as together. Part 9. The Point of No Return. The morning of May 15th dawned clear and bright over the Connecticut landscape, with spring sunshine streaming through the windows of the boarding house that had been Maggie's home for so many years of struggle and uncertainty. Her trunk stood packed and ready beside the front door, containing everything she owned that seemed worth carrying into her new life. Her mother's china carefully wrapped in layers of newspaper, the letters from Thomas and Lucy that had sustained her through the darkest months of separation, and the few dresses that remained respectable enough for meeting her future husband and stepdaughter. Rose moved around the familiar rooms with the efficient bustle of someone determined not to let emotion interfere with necessary tasks, but Maggie could see the tears her sister was fighting to control as she made final preparations for a farewell. Neither of them had quite believed would actually come to pass. After so many months of uncertainty, of delayed departures and changed plans, the reality of separation seemed almost too momentous to be happening on such an ordinary Tuesday morning. "The train leaves Hartford at 11:30, Rose said for the third time that morning, consulting the pocket watch that had belonged to their father and which she now carried with the gravity of someone assuming family responsibilities. "That gives you time for breakfast and a final check of your room to make sure you haven't forgotten anything important." Her voice remained steady, but Maggie noticed the way her sister's hands trembled slightly as she folded and refolded the travel instructions that Thomas had sent with meticulous care. Maggie walked through the boarding house one final time, visiting each room that had been part of her daily routine for the past 3 years, saying silent goodbyes to the life she had built from the ashes of her first marriage. The kitchen where she had struggled to stretch meager ingredients into meals that would satisfy working men. The parlor where she had kept the books and managed accounts that never quite balanced. The small bedroom under the eaves where she had spent so many nights wondering if she would ever find the courage to reach for something better. Her parents were waiting in the front parlor, both of them dressed in their best clothes despite the early hour, understanding that this farewell carried the weight of finality that most goodbyes mercifully lack. Her father, still bearing the marks of his illness, but improved enough to make the journey from Rose's house for this special occasion, embraced her with arms that shook from emotion as much as physical weakness. "I never thought I'd live to see you happy again," he whispered against her ear, his voice thick with the tears he was too old and too tired to suppress. "Your mother and I worried that James's death had broken something in you that couldn't be mended. But these past months, watching you come back to life through those letters, seeing you smile when you talk about your new family, it's been worth everything we've been through." Her mother's farewell was quieter, but no less emotional, consisting mostly of practical advice about travel safety and stern reminders to write frequently. But as Maggie prepared to leave for the train station, her mother pressed a small package into her hands with instructions not to open it until she was safely aboard the train. "Something for your new home," she explained simply, "and something to remember that you'll always have. Family here if you need us." The ride to the Hartford station passed in a blur of familiar streets and landmarks that Maggie tried to memorize, understanding that she was unlikely to see them again for many years, if ever. Rose sat beside her in the hired carriage, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will, but occasionally reaching over to squeeze Maggie's hand in wordless support and encouragement. At the station, the reality of separation finally overcame both sisters' attempts at composure. Rose held Maggie fiercely, whispering fierce assurances that everything would work out perfectly, that Thomas and Lucy were lucky to be getting such a wonderful addition to their family, that the life waiting in Colorado would make all the years of struggle worthwhile. Maggie found herself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was attempting and the knowledge that failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but the loss of connections that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. "Write to me the moment you arrive," Rose demanded, stepping back to study her sister's face with the intensity of someone memorizing features she might not see again for years. "Write to me the moment you arrive, and don't you dare spare my feelings. If things don't work out the way we've hoped, promise me you'll come home if you're not happy, no matter what anyone else might think." "Undine, I promise," Maggie managed to whisper, though both sisters understood that some journeys change a person so fundamentally that return becomes impossible regardless of circumstances. The train whistle sounded its first warning, a mournful note that seemed to echo the ache in both their hearts as they faced the reality of separation that distance would make complete. The conductor's call of "all aboard" rang across the platform with the authority of inevitability, and Maggie found herself climbing the steep metal steps into a world that smelled of coal smoke and unfamiliar possibilities. Her car was nearly full, occupied by families heading west for reasons as varied as the passengers themselves. Farmers seeking cheaper land, merchants chasing new markets, young couples drawn by tales of opportunity that the established East could no longer provide. As the train pulled away from Hartford station with gathering speed, Maggie pressed her face to the window and watched her sister's figure grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the crowd of people who belonged to the world she was leaving behind. Only then did she allow herself to open the package her mother had pressed into her hands, discovering inside a delicate lace tablecloth that had belonged to her grandmother, along with a note written in her mother's careful script. "For your new dining room," the note read, "and for the family dinners you'll share with the husband and daughter who are waiting for you. Every family needs something beautiful to gather around, something that connects the generations and makes a house feel like a home. May this cloth witness many years of happiness and bind your new family together with love." The simple gift undid what remained of Maggie's composure, and she wept quietly into her handkerchief as the Connecticut countryside rolled past her window, grieving not just for what she was leaving behind, but for the overwhelming weight of hope and expectation that rode with her toward an uncertain future. She was no longer simply Margaret Sullivan, struggling widow and reluctant keeper of a failing boarding house. She was a woman traveling toward love, carrying the dreams and blessings of everyone who had supported her through the darkest years of her life. The journey west unfolded in stages that marked not just geographical distance, but emotional progression toward a completely different existence. The first day carried her through familiar territory, past industrial cities that reminded her of Hartford, through landscapes that differed in detail, but not in character, from everything she had known. But as the second day dawned and the train carried her beyond the Mississippi River, Maggie found herself in country that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The vastness was the first thing that struck her, the way the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions without the comforting boundaries of hills or forests to define and limit the view. She had read Thomas's descriptions of Western space in his letters, but no combination of words could have prepared her for the reality of land unbroken by human habitation, sky that seemed to press down with its immensity, distances that made her feel both insignificant and somehow eternal. At Kansas City, where she was met by Thomas's sister-in-law as promised, Maggie encountered her first taste of frontier hospitality and discovered that kindness took different forms in different places. Martha Hendricks was a woman weathered, by prairie wind and hardship, but possessed of a warmth that transcended any superficial roughness, welcoming Maggie into her modest home as if she were a beloved relative rather than a stranger passing through. "Tom's letters have been full of nothing but you and Lucy for months now," Martha confided as they shared a simple but hearty dinner of beef stew and fresh bread. That man was near to dying of loneliness after Sarah passed, though he'd never admit such a thing. And that little girl of his, quiet as a church mouse and twice as serious. They both need someone like you, someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still have the courage to start over. The conversation continued long into the evening, with Martha sharing stories about Thomas's arrival in Colorado, his struggles to establish the ranch, the way Sarah's death had changed both him and Lucy in ways that concerned everyone who cared about them. "He's a good man," she assured Maggie, "steady and honest and devoted to that child. But he's forgotten how to hope for anything beyond simple survival, and Lucy's forgotten how to be a little girl. You're going to change all that just by showing up and caring about them." The final day of travel brought Maggie into mountain country that defied every expectation she had formed based on the gentle hills of Connecticut. The train climbed steadily through passes that seemed to hang suspended between earth and sky, past peaks that wore crowns of snow even in late spring, through valleys so beautiful they made her throat tight with wonder and anticipation. This was the landscape Thomas and Lucy called home, the world they had invited her to share, and its magnificent otherness both thrilled and intimidated her. Pine Ridge appeared around a bend in the track like something from a fairy tale, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, surrounded by mountains that rose like cathedral spires toward a sky so blue it seemed artificial. The train station was little more than a platform with a small building attached, but to Maggie it represented the end of one life and the beginning of another, the place where months of correspondence would finally translate into face-to-face reality. As the train shuddered to a stop with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes, Maggie gathered her courage along with her belongings, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether the leap of faith she had taken would prove justified or catastrophic. Through the window, she could see a small crowd gathered on the platform, but her eyes immediately found the tall figure standing slightly apart from the others, a man whose serious expression and work-worn hands matched exactly the photograph she had studied so many times during the long months of separation. Thomas Bennett looked older than his 34 years, marked by sun and wind and responsibility in ways that no photograph could capture. But there was something in his posture that spoke of reliability and strength. Beside him stood a girl who barely reached his waist, dark-haired and solemn, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers with the intensity of someone performing a sacred duty. Lucy had grown since the photograph was taken, but she still carried herself with the careful precision of a child who had learned too young that the world could be unpredictable and dangerous. The moment Maggie stepped onto the platform, carrying her single carpet bag and wearing her only traveling dress, she felt the weight of 3 lives converging after months of existing only in imagination and hope. Thomas approached her with steps that seemed measured and deliberate, his expression serious but not unwelcoming, and when he stopped before her, the silence that stretched between them carried the weight of everything they had shared through letters but never spoken aloud. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said finally, his voice exactly as she had imagined it would be, deep and steady and tinged with an emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "You made it safely. We've been watching for your train since dawn." The simple words carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with travel schedules and everything to do with the careful hope that had sustained all of them through the long months of separation. "Mr. Bennett," Maggie replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice when her heart was racing with nervous excitement. "Thank you for meeting me. The journey was long, but worth every mile." She looked down at Lucy, who was studying her with the intense scrutiny of a child trying to reconcile a real person with months of imagination, and smiled with genuine warmth. "And you must be Lucy. I've been so looking forward to meeting you." Lucy stepped forward with the careful formality that had become her shield against disappointment, extending the bouquet of wildflowers with a small curtsy that would have been charming if it hadn't seemed so practiced and careful. "Welcome to Pine Ridge, Mrs. Sullivan," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I picked these flowers this morning from the meadow behind our house. Papa said you might like them." Maggie accepted the flowers with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that this simple gift represented Lucy's first tentative step toward trust and acceptance. "They're absolutely beautiful," she said, breathing in their sweet fragrance and meaning every word. "I've never seen wildflowers quite like these. Will you teach me their names and show me where they grow?" For the first time since Maggie's arrival, Lucy's careful composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the curious, eager child that lived beneath her protective silence. "There's Indian paintbrush and lupine and columbine," she said, pointing to different flowers in the bouquet, "and shooting stars down by the creek, but they don't last long once you pick them. I can show you all the best places if you want to see them." The wagon ride to the ranch passed in a comfortable mixture of conversation and shared silence, with Thomas pointing out landmarks and Lucy adding occasional comments about favorite places and secret hideaways. The countryside was even more beautiful than Maggie had imagined, with mountains rising in every direction and meadows carpeted with flowers that painted the landscape in shades of purple, yellow, and red. But more important than the scenery was the growing sense that she was not just visiting this place, but coming home to it. That the family she had imagined through months of letters was becoming real in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The ranch house appeared around a bend in the mountain road, exactly as Lucy had drawn it in her letters, surrounded by the flower gardens she had planted and the improvements Thomas had made in preparation for Maggie's arrival. But the reality was somehow more welcoming than any drawing could convey, with smoke curling from the chimney and windows that gleamed golden in the afternoon sunlight, promising warmth and comfort and the kind of domestic peace that Maggie had stopped believing possible for someone like herself. "It's perfect," she breathed, meaning every word as she took in the sight of what would be her new home. Even more beautiful than Lucy's pictures made it seem. She looked at both Thomas and Lucy, seeing in their faces the same mixture of hope and nervousness that she felt in her own heart. "Thank you both for making me feel so welcome. I know this must be strange for all of us, but I want you to know that I'm not here to change everything you've built together. I'm here to add to it, to become part of what you already have." That evening, as they sat together around the kitchen table, sharing the dinner that Thomas and Lucy had prepared in her honor, Maggie felt the last of her doubts dissolving into certainty that she had made the right choice. The conversation flowed easily, mixing practical discussions about ranch life with shared memories from their correspondence. And gradually, the formal politeness of their initial meeting gave way to the comfortable familiarity of people who had known each other for months, even if only through written words. Lucy, emboldened by Maggie's genuine interest in her drawings and stories, gradually became more talkative, sharing details about her daily life and asking questions about Connecticut that revealed how carefully she had listened to every letter. Thomas had read aloud. When bedtime arrived, she surprised everyone, including herself, by spontaneously hugging Maggie goodnight, a gesture that brought tears to all their eyes and marked the beginning of the trust that would grow into genuine love. As Thomas showed Maggie to the room he had prepared for her, painted yellow and furnished with care, she felt the profound satisfaction of a journey completed and a new life successfully begun. The months of correspondence had created a foundation strong enough to support the reality of daily life together, And the people she had come to love through letters were proving even more wonderful in person than they had been on paper. Standing at her bedroom window as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Maggie whispered a prayer of gratitude for the courage that had brought her to this moment and the love that would sustain her through all the moments yet to come. She had left behind everything familiar and safe to reach for something better, and the gamble had paid off in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic dreams. The letters from Rose that would arrive in the weeks and months ahead would carry news of Hartford's continuing decline, of friends and neighbors who envied Maggie's escape but lacked the courage to attempt their own. But by then, Maggie would be too busy building her new life to spare more than passing thoughts for the world she had left behind. She had found her home, her family, and her future in a valley surrounded by mountains, where the sky stretched endlessly and love was measured not in grand gestures, but in daily kindnesses shared between people who had chosen each other across distance and difficulty. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.